One of my all-time favorite movies, one that I have forced most of my friends to watch with me more than once, is the 2005 film Constantine, in which Keanu Reeves plays a rather complicated and difficult exorcist who's trapped in the middle of a battle between heaven and hell. It is theologically rife with a combination of both voodoo and Catholic myth, but I love it. But you shouldn't assume that it has anything to do with the leading actor's personal beliefs. On The Tonight Show a couple of years ago, Stephen Colbert asked Reeves, "What happens when you die?" And his answer left Stephen Colbert speechless for a full 10 seconds. Reeves says simply, "I know that the ones who love us will miss us," which is a kinder way of expressing the rather flat-footed quote from the fallen comedian Louis C.K., who said, "Lots of things happen after you die. They just don't involve you." Religious people are often shocked by such frank acknowledgments of our mortality. But that's no wonder, since most of us have been spoon-fed a pie-in-the-sky theology all of our lives. Even more progressive churches of past generations passively repeated the grand bargain that says that if you're willing to endure enough church services, if you're willing to pray enough and pay enough, if you can be good enough and avoid egregious sins, then when you die, your immortal soul will not be tormented in hell, and you may in fact enjoy eternal reward. We have been so trained in that kind of carrot and stick theology that we can hardly imagine being religious without having accepted the premise of the bargain. Sure, there's a lot of talk about loving God and loving the Lord, but there is very little love in this equation. There's fear and there's greed, but I don't see much love. I did my doctoral dissertation on monastic spirituality. I spent a lot of time for a few years spending retreats in Trappist and Jesuit monasteries, and I was deeply immersed in the literature of the historical monastic movements, the Rule of St. Benedict, the Cloud of Unknowing, the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, the Imitation of Christ, and the whole body of books by the 20th century monastic Thomas Merton. But it was the 16th century Spanish monk, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, who spelled out the grand bargain most clearly. He said, "Man is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save his soul." In his famous book, The Spiritual Exercises, he encourages prospective monks to consider also the innumerable others who have gone to hell for fewer sins than you have committed. For centuries, the church successfully made millions of people afraid of going to hell, and just stated that they would live for eternity either in bliss or in torment based on how well they praised, reverenced, and served God, without ever giving the slightest bit of evidence that anyone has a soul or that either heaven or hell exists. It was the biggest "the emperor has no clothes" scheme in history, and yet very few people have been willing to say out loud what is obviously true. As my homiletics professor, David Buttrick, regularly reminded us, the mortality rate is 100%. And he was a man who really wanted to believe in life after death. He told us that he took a year off after his young son died so that he could read all the literature he could find about the afterlife. And he said, after a year of study, that he found that it was all just wishful thinking with no substance. A fairy tale we tell ourselves to take the edge off of our grief. But no matter how many million people have been told by some pious prick, "You should be happy for your son, he's in a much better place now," I doubt that anyone actually believed it. His son's better place was at the dinner table with his mom and dad, or playing baseball in the backyard with the other neighborhood kids. Lying about grief may help some people, but I think for most of us, it is just an insult to the memory of someone that we loved very much. It seems to be more respectful to simply acknowledge, as Cano Reeves says, that we miss them very much, and not try to dismiss our grief with an obvious lie. I love the Wallace Stevens poem, The Emperor of Ice Cream, but I've always found it odd that scholars and students spend so much time debating what on earth it means. One English professor says, while there are some lines that are impossible to comprehend, that it is probably about a wake in the Caribbean where the tradition is to serve sweets to those who come to view the body and to sit with the family. Honestly, I wonder if it is difficult to understand because we don't want to acknowledge the fact that the only emperor, the only real authority in life, is death. The mortality rate is 100%. Stephen's poem is full of images of things that are temporary. He says, "Call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him whip in kitchen cups concupiscent curds. Let the wenches dawdle in such dress as they are used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers in last month's newspapers." You see, everything in the verse is an image of something that has a very short life. A cigar, sadly, is finished in minutes. If you've ever had the pleasure of eating homemade ice cream, the only kind available generations ago before ice cream became a grocery store item, I can remember those hot, humid Kentucky summer days of my youth before there was air conditioning, when my dad and older brother would take turns cranking the handle of the ice cream churn, packing chipped ice with Epsom salt around the metal cylinder in the bucket, getting the contents cold enough to freeze. But when all of the labor was done and Mom gave us all a little bowl of the frozen curds, you could literally watch it turning back into a milky soup right before your eyes. We worked so hard to make it, and it had to be eaten quickly or it just melted away. And this verse mentions cut flowers, which begin to wilt as soon as they are cut, wrapped in not yesterday's newspaper, but last month's newspaper, something that is already dead and gone, good only to wrap up a fish or cut flowers. All things that only have a very short life. And the poet utters in the refrain, "Let be final of scene, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream." Stevens is asking us to just accept it. Let it be. Don't try to deny it. Don't try to cover it up in flowery religious language, because the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. I think it's important for us to be aware that the current modern belief in life after death is not normative in all places and in all centuries. In the earlier centuries of the Jewish religion, there was no belief in an afterlife. Even in the time of Jesus, as we see reflected in the gospel accounts of the conflicts between the Jewish sects, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they had a sharp disagreement about whether or not there was life after death. Aristotle believed that life was somehow eternal, but he didn't believe in individual mortality. For Aristotle, it was more that your life force evaporates when you die and is taken up into a cloud that then rains down as life in other forms, trees and ducks and people. And as you know, there are various forms of incarnational belief in Eastern religions, but our Western images of heaven and hell associated with later Christianity is not the norm. Still, there have been critics of these issues all through the Christian era. But I believe that the 19th century German theologian Ludwig Feuerbach expressed it best in his book, Thoughts on Death and Immortality. Sadly, because denying the existence of heaven and hell was so controversial, even Feuerbach published it anonymously. I hate to say that there are thoughts that the world wants to censor even before they are aired. The late Scott Peck said, "Anything that cannot be questioned is an idol. and all idols are slated for destruction. I realize that most Christians and Muslims and many Jews and Buddhists would not agree with what I'm saying today, but they should at least allow me to say what I believe, just as I give them the liberty to be mistaken. It is, after all, only fair. Feuerbach makes the observation that I've tried so often to point out to my religious peers that there is no evidence, that is to say, none, zip, nada evidence for consciousness apart from the body. Engels and Marx had read Feuerbach's books and said at the time that his book had profound liberating effects and that it had broken the spell of the Hegelian system and established the truth that human consciousness is the only consciousness or spirit or soul that exists, and that it is dependent upon the physical existence of human beings as a part of nature. One of the consistent complaints that I have with my own discipline in philosophy is that philosophers give way too much time and energy to thinking about what might be possible and not nearly enough time correcting themselves by thinking about what is more probable. Anyone can say that you cannot prove that there's no heaven or hell because, in all cases, you cannot prove a negative. You cannot prove that there are no unicorns in the world, but you can say that there's no evidence for their existence, and in the absence of a reason to believe in unicorns, we need to acknowledge that the probability is very low. While it may be, in some inexplicable way, possible for consciousness to exist apart from a body, there's no evidence for it, and therefore no reason to believe that it is the least bit probable. You can't prove that I'm not Spider-Man, but I warn you, don't jump off of a high building believing that I'm going to swing down and save you, because that probably isn't going to happen. Feuerbach, by the way, had nothing to say about Spider-Man. A great miss. I realize that if this is the first time you are hearing a minister say that there is no heaven or hell, that it might be unsettling. It's hard to hear something that is contrary to what you have always believed and on which you have staked a whole lot of your religious faith and assumptions about your own existence. This is huge, and such a change is not easy, and most people will decide not to do it. But even if you do, your first feeling is a feeling of loss. If you have been raised with the whole carrot and stick grand bargain, it's very difficult to think differently, even though I hope that you do. Feuerbach discusses it in the impossibly difficult style of a German philosopher, but put more simply, eternity is a long time, and if we did have eternal life, it would cheapen our mortal existence, making it almost irrelevant. In fact, we have all heard more than one preacher put it exactly that way, telling us that our mortal lives are of no importance because what is one grain of sand when you can walk across the whole beach? Even the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that the momentary suffering we endure in this life is meaningless in comparison with our eternal home in heaven. That thinking has encouraged not only Paul, but millions of priests and pastors to encourage people to have to commit to staying in a bad marriage, or even to remain in slavery. But the conditions of life in this world mean nothing to them in comparison to eternity. Most of us have known more than one person who refused life-saving surgery or cancer treatments because they welcomed the idea of dying as a portal into a better life, incapable of conceiving that the universe might just be able to go on without them. They really needed to have seriously considered Louis C.K.'s observation. A lot goes on when you die, but it just doesn't involve you. I'm saying that it is precisely because we are mortal that life is precious, sacred even. You only have so many sunsets. There are only so many evenings when you can sit and talk with an aging parent to really get to know your own mother or father. Our children grow up, they leave home, they have careers and friends and kids of their own. I wish that I had a century to show my preschool-age daughter the wonders of the world, but in fact, her preschool years were over in a flash, and I can't get any of those days back. And now I wonder, why did I work so much? Why did I let so many other things crowd out that time? Now, if you eat out in public with me, you are likely to see me stopping by the table with families and young children, especially when the parents are staring into their phone or getting impatient with their toddlers for being toddlers. I walk up to total strangers with my white beard and thinning hair, and I tell them, life doesn't get any better than this. Savor every moment. The German-American poet of the mid-20th century, Charles Bukowski, said it as clearly as anyone can. We're all going to die, all of us. What a circus. That alone should make us love each other, but it doesn't. We are terrorized and flattened by trivialities. We are eaten up by nothing. Clearly, in the light of our mortality, we should focus on what is important. We should be quick to forgive our siblings, even if they voted for Donald Trump. We should do whatever we have to do to get conflict out of our marriage, to make holidays absolutely super for our kids, and to put in the effort to hold friendships together. And we should do it now, while we still can. The Buddha didn't really say it, but one of my favorite fake Buddha quotes is, "The trouble is, you think you have time." The truth is that the mortality rate is 100%, and it typically comes much quicker than we thought it would. So grab today with both hands and live as much as you possibly can while you can, so that when we are gone, the people who knew us will miss us.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.